Imagine a place so dark, so cold, and so thick, with the stench of rot and cordite, that even the ancient trees seem to bleed a 50-square-mile nightmare on the Belgian-German border, known simply as the green hell of the Hürtgen Forest, where American boys were sent to die in a meat grinder that time forgot. It was late autumn in 1944, and while the American public was being told the war in Europe was wrapping up by Christmas, our GIs were trapped in a vertical labyrinth of dense fir trees, mined ridges, and concrete pillboxes, where the German Wehrmacht had laid a trap so lethal it would claim over 33,000 American casualties. Up in their dry, heated underground bunkers behind the Siegfried Line, high-ranking German officers of the 5th Panzer Army and the 7th Army poured snifters of captured French cognac, looked over the staggering casualty reports of the American 28th and 9th Infantry Divisions, and did the one thing you should never do when fighting the United States military. They laughed, mocking the courage of our boys, calling them soft, amateur weekend warriors who couldn't fight their way out of a wet paper bag without their precious air support. But that arrogant laughter was about to travel across the frozen mud right into the ears of a man who possessed a temper hotter than a molten steel furnace and a soul forged in the ancient fires of war. General George S. Patton, Jr. Before we dive into the chilling moment, Patton caught wind of this disrespect and decided to personally write a bloody, iron-fisted reply that the Wehrmacht would never forget. I want to welcome you to the channel and ask you a quick favor. If you have the blood of patriots running through your veins, and you believe that the untold stories of our greatest generation must never be forgotten, hit that subscribe button. Smash that like button, and let us know in the comments right now down below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what does the legendary name of General George S. Patton mean to you and your family? We want to read your honest opinions, because this channel is built for the true blue patriots who know that freedom isn't free. So stick around, because we've got a story today that will make your chest swell with pride and leave you on the absolute edge of your seat. To understand why the Germans were laughing, you have to understand the absolute slaughterhouse that was the Hürtgen Forest, where American commanders, in a rare and tragic display of tactical stubbornness, kept throwing raw, inexperienced divisions into a dense, sunless canopy where artillery shells hit the tops of 100-foot pine trees, detonating them downward in a rain of razor-sharp wooden shrapnel that shredded limbs, tore faces, and left men bleeding out in the freezing mud, while German machine gunners, pre-ranged on every single trail, cut down entire platoons in seconds. The American 28th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Bloody Bucket because of their red keystone shoulder patch, was literally torn to pieces, losing over 6,000 men in just a matter of days, their tanks sliding off muddy mountain trails into deep ravines where they became sitting ducks for German Panzerfaust teams. In the German command bunkers, the aristocratic Prussian generals, who had been studying military science since they were boys, viewed this disaster as absolute proof that the American soldier was a fragile creature of comfort, unable to fight under brutal winter conditions, without hot meals, and overwhelming air power, which was currently grounded due to the miserable, foggy weather. When reports reached the desk of German General Erich Brandenberger, his staff officers reportedly chuckled, joking about how the green American recruits were throwing down their weapons and crying for their mothers in the dark woods, mockingly referring to the U.S. Army as a paper tiger that was finally getting its teeth kicked in. Little did these smug Wehrmacht officers know, their laughter had just crossed the path of Patton's intelligence network, and when the translation of captured German diaries and radio intercepts containing these mocking jokes reached Patton's 3rd Army headquarters further south, the atmosphere in the room turned instantly ice cold. Patton, standing there in his polished riding boots, his ivory-handled Colt, .45 revolvers strapped to his hips, and his eyes burning with a terrifying righteous fury, didn't just get mad. He became a force of pure, unadulterated destruction, whispering a promise to his staff that he would not only stop their laughter, but he would make sure the German army choked on its own blood before the winter was through. He knew his own Third Army was currently chomping at the bit, and he was about to unleash a level of American military wrath that would make the German High Command realize they hadn't just made a tactical mistake, they had signed their own death warrants. But how exactly could Patton intervene when his Third Army was miles away, bogged down in its own fight in the Saar region? And the incompetent Allied High Command was still ordering troops directly into the Hürtgen death trap. The stage was set for one of the most audacious, high-stakes military gambits in the history of human warfare, a moment where Patton would have to defy his superiors, outmaneuver the entire German army, and prove once and for all what happens when you mock the fighting spirit of the United States of America. To fully grasp the sheer, unadulterated madness of what Patton was about to pull off, you have to picture the chessboard of Western Europe in mid-December 1944, where the Supreme Allied Command was sitting fat, dumb, and happy, utterly convinced that the back of the German beast was broken, and that the Wehrmacht was purely capable of nothing more than a desperate, dying crawl. But down in the frozen trenches, our brave GIs knew a completely different, terrifying truth as the biting winter wind howled through the pines, and the German High Command, emboldened by their bloody success in the Hürtgen Forest, decided to double down on their arrogance by launching a massive, secret, all-out counter-offensive through the heavily forested Ardennes region, a sudden, thunderous blitzkrieg that would become known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler had thrown his finest, most ruthless SS Panzer divisions and hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened troops into a desperate gamble to split the Allied lines, capture the key port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace, catching the Allied brass completely flat-footed, sleeping at the wheel, and sending shockwaves of panic all the way back to Washington. As the German juggernaut smashed through the thin American lines, creating a massive, deep bulge in the front, and trapping the elite 101st Airborne Division in the crucial crossroads town of Bastogne. Those same smug German generals who had laughed at our boys in the Hürtgen Forest were now absolutely convinced they had the Americans on the run, openly boasting that the soft, pampered boys from across the Atlantic would fold like a cheap lawn chair under the pressure of a real German winter offensive. But while the Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower and his staff were huddled in a cold, tense conference room in Verdun, sweating bullets and trying to figure out how to stop this seemingly unstoppable gray tide, George S. Patton stood in the corner, calmly chewing on a giant cigar, his brilliant mind already 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room, because his legendary G2 intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had actually sniffed out the German buildup days before the first artillery shell even fell. When Eisenhower, looking pale and completely exhausted, turned to Patton and asked how long it would take him to disengage his entire Third Army from their fierce fighting in the Saar region, turn them a full 90 degrees north into the teeth of a raging blizzard, and launch a massive counterattack to save the trapped boys at Bastogne, the room fell dead silent as Patton looked Ike dead in the eye, and without missing a single beat, casually barked out, 3 days. The other generals in the room literally gasped, some of them openly scoffing and whispering that Patton's legendary ego had finally driven him completely insane. Because moving an entire field army of over 250,000 men, 70,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of ammunition and fuel over 100 miles of icy, single-lane roads in the middle of the worst winter storm Europe had seen in a generation was logistically impossible, a task that standard military doctrine said would take at least a couple of weeks to plan and execute. What these doubters didn't realize was that Patton, possessing the razor-sharp tactical instincts of a predatory wolf, had already secretly ordered his staff to draw up 3 different operational plans for this exact pivot days before the meeting even started, meaning that while the Allied High Command was still debating what to do, Patton's Hell on Wheels Third Army was already warming up their tank engines, packing up their gear, and preparing to unleash absolute hell on the arrogant Germans. But as Patton stepped out of that high-stakes meeting into the freezing French air, he knew he was facing the ultimate gamble of his entire life. Because if even one cog in his massive, complex military machine slipped on the icy roads, or if the German panzer divisions managed to overrun Bastogne before he arrived, the entire Allied front could collapse, turning his daring rescue mission into one of the most catastrophic disasters in the history of the United States military. The tension was thick enough to cut with a combat knife as the order went down to the freezing GIs of the Third Army. They were about to pull off a logistical miracle that defied every single rule in the book, driving day and night through blinding snowstorms with their headlights blacked out, sleeping standing up, and eating frozen K-rations just to reach the fight in time to wipe the arrogant smirks right off the faces of the German generals. But could Patton really defy the laws of physics and military logistics to save his brothers in arms? Or was he marching his beloved Third Army straight into a giant, freezing German trap that would solidify the Wehrmacht's laughter forever? What you are looking at in this frozen, hellish landscape of December 1944 is quite literally the greatest logistical and tactical miracle in the entire history of modern warfare. A moment where American grit and pure, stubborn horsepower proved to the high and mighty German Wehrmacht that when you mess with the United States of America, you are playing with a fire that will consume you whole. The German High Command, still high on their own supply, after boasting about how they'd turned our boys into mincemeat in the dark, frozen pines of the Hürtgen Forest, had no earthly idea that a storm was brewing in the south, a storm named Georgie Patton, that was about to hit them like a freight train loaded with high explosives and raw American fury. Picture this: over 133,000 vehicles of the U.S. Third Army, from massive Sherman tanks and rumbling deuce-and-a-half trucks to nimble jeeps and heavy artillery pieces, suddenly slamming into reverse, peeling out of their muddy fighting positions in the Saar region, and turning on a dime in the middle of a screaming blizzard that would make a polar bear shiver. We're talking about 250,000 GIs, guys from places like Brooklyn, Chicago, the backwoods of Alabama, and the cornfields of Iowa, who had been fighting tooth and nail for weeks, suddenly being told to pack up their gear, load up, and drive north into the pitch-black night over roads that had been transformed into solid sheets of black ice, all while keeping their headlights completely blacked out to avoid spotting by German Luftwaffe night fighters. It was a logistical nightmare that would have given a computer a nervous breakdown. But our boys didn't complain. They just gritted their teeth, wrapped burlap sacks around their boots to keep from freezing, and pushed those trucks and tanks through the blinding snow, driving bumper to bumper with less than 6 feet of visibility. Because they knew their brothers in the 101st Airborne were surrounded at Bastogne and running out of ammo, medicine, and time. Meanwhile, up in the German headquarters, the arrogant Wehrmacht generals were sitting pretty, looking at their maps and laughing off the reports of American movement in the south, dismissing it as a disorganized, panicky retreat, because, in their elitist Prussian minds, there was absolutely no way any army on earth could mobilize that many men and machines through a raging alpine blizzard in less than a week, let alone 3 days. German Field Marshal Walter Model and General Erich Brandenberger, the very same guy who had chuckled over his glass of schnapps at the American losses in the Hürtgen Forest, were confidently telling their staff that the Americans were too soft, too paralyzed by the cold, and too reliant on their fancy heated tents to mount any kind of serious counter-offensive in this weather. Oh boy, were they about to get the rudest awakening of their entire miserable lives, because Patton wasn't just coming to relieve Bastogne, he was coming to completely annihilate the German army's southern flank and make them pay in blood for every single sarcastic joke they had made at the expense of our dead GIs. To ensure his boys had the ultimate upper hand, Patton did something so wild, so completely unconventional, that it has gone down in military legend as one of the balliest moves ever made by a commanding general. He looked up at the gray, miserable sky that had kept Allied air support grounded for days, called up his chief chaplain, Father James O'Neill, and demanded he write a direct, no-nonsense prayer to Almighty God for 24 hours of clear weather so his fighter bombers could get up in the air and start raining hellfire on the German panzers. The chaplain was absolutely stunned, asking Patton if he was seriously trying to order God around. To which Patton basically replied that he didn't care who he had to pull rank on. He needed the weather cleared so he could kill Germans. And he wanted that prayer printed on 250,000 small cards and distributed to every single soldier in the Third Army immediately, whether it was pure coincidence or divine intervention. The very next morning, the thick blanket of fog and snow miraculously parted. The sun broke through the clouds like a golden spear, and the sky was suddenly filled with the roar of hundreds of American P-47 Thunderbolts screaming over the snow-covered treetops, looking for anything painted in German gray, and blowing it to smithereens. Down on the ground, the lead elements of Patton's 4th Armored Division, led by the legendary, cigar-chomping Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, slammed into the German lines south of Bastogne like a sledgehammer hitting a concrete wall, catching the elite German 5th Parachute Division and the Panzerlehr Division completely off guard, their smug smiles instantly evaporating as American tank shells turned their armored vehicles into burning metal coffins. The Germans, who had been laughing in the Hürtgen Forest just weeks earlier, were now screaming in terror as Patton's hell-on-wheels GIs charged through the snowdrift, firing from the hip, their M1 Garand rifles barking out a deadly rhythm of freedom that echoed through the valleys. But the battle was far from over, because the German High Command, realizing that their entire Ardennes offensive was now in mortal danger of being cut off and strangled by Patton's rapid advance, frantically ordered their most brutal, fanatical SS Panzer divisions to pivot south and block the American relief column at all costs, setting the stage for a titanic, bloody clash of armor and infantry in the frozen wastes around Bastogne that would decide the fate of the entire Western Front. Can you even begin to imagine the sheer adrenaline pumping through the veins of those young American tank crews as they saw the massive, terrifying silhouettes of German Tiger and Panther tanks emerging from the winter fog, knowing that the lives of thousands of trapped paratroopers depended entirely on their ability to outshoot, outmaneuver, and outfight the most feared war machine in Europe? This was the moment of truth, the split second where all that aristocratic, high-nosed German arrogance collided head-on with a wall of pure American steel, horsepower, and cold-blooded determination. The German generals who had been laughing in their warm, oak-paneled headquarters while reading the casualty lists of the Hürtgen Forest were about to find out that when you kick a sleeping dog in the teeth, you'd better be prepared for the jaws that lock onto your throat. On December 26, 1944, at exactly 4:50 p.m., the frozen, battle-scarred landscape around the small village of Assenois, just south of Bastogne, erupted into a volcanic symphony of violence as a single, heavily armored American Sherman jumbo tank, nicknamed Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, smashed through the final German blockading line like a runaway freight train. The tank's 75 mm gun was hot to the touch, its machine guns spitting continuous streams of lead that cut down the fleeing German paratroopers who, just hours earlier, had been boasting about how they were going to hang the screaming eagles of the 101st Airborne from the nearest pine trees. Following closely behind Cobra King was a ragtag, hard-charging column of half-tracks and infantrymen from the 4th Armored Division, their faces caked in black soot, gunpowder, and frozen sweat, screaming like banshees as they broke through the encirclement and made physical contact with the battered, frostbitten, but utterly defiant men of the 101st. The relief of Bastogne wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a massive, swinging sledgehammer to the jaw of the German Wehrmacht's collective ego, a moment that instantly turned the tide of the entire winter campaign and sent shockwaves of sheer, unadulterated panic straight up the German chain of command. When General Erich Brandenberger, the very man who had chuckled at the American soldiers' supposed weakness, received the frantic radio message that Patton's tanks had broken through his lines, he reportedly dropped his map-marking pencil in disbelief, his face draining of all color as he realized that the soft, amateur Americans had just pulled off the impossible in the middle of a historic blizzard. All that smug, self-satisfied laughter that had echoed through the warm bunkers of the Siegfried Line suddenly turned into ashes in the throats of the German officers, as they realized they weren't dealing with a disorganized mob of green recruits anymore. They were trapped in a freezing cage with a highly mobilized, vengeful apex predator that was hungry for blood. Patton, riding in his open-topped command car with a heavy wool coat wrapped around him and his eyes locked on the horizon, didn't give his men a single second to celebrate or rest on their laurels. He knew that the enemy was off balance, bleeding, and terrified, and in Patton's Book of War, that was the exact moment you pressed your boot down onto their throats and didn't stop pressing until you heard the bone snap. He immediately ordered his divisions to expand the corridor, fan out across the snow-covered fields, and launch a relentless, high-speed offensive to encircle and destroy the very German divisions that had bragged about their triumphs in the Hürtgen Forest. The fighting that followed was some of the most brutal, vicious, and unforgiving close-quarters combat of the entire war in Europe. A savage slugfest in the waist-deep snowdrifts, where the temperature dropped way below zero, and the grease inside the M1 Garand rifles and Browning machine guns froze solid, forcing our boys to scrape the lubricants off their weapons and fire them completely dry, just to keep them from jamming in the middle of a German counter charge. American GIs, fueled by a righteous anger and the memory of their fallen brothers who had been slaughtered in the green hell of the Hürtgen, fought with a savage, primitive intensity that absolutely shocked the Germans, using bayonets, trench knives, and even their bare fists in the pitch-black woods to clear out the stubborn Wehrmacht pockets of resistance. Patton's artillery, which he famously referred to as the King of Battle, was unleashed with a terrifying, calculated precision, utilizing a revolutionary new technology called the VT radio proximity fuse, which made the artillery shells explode in the air directly above the heads of the retreating Germans, raining millions of razor-sharp steel fragments down into their open trenches and vehicles, leaving them with absolutely nowhere to hide. The German soldiers, who had been taught by their Nazi propaganda machine that the Americans were weak, degenerate, and incapable of fighting without massive material superiority, were now writing frantic, terrified letters back home to their families, describing Patton's Third Army as black devils and mass murderers who didn't seem to care about the cold, the snow, or the rules of engagement, and who fought with a relentless, terrifying speed that felt like a nightmare come to life. As the German lines began to crumble, crack, and dissolve under this unrelenting American pressure, the high-ranking Wehrmacht staff officers, who had once scoffed at the U.S. military, were now desperately packing up their headquarters files, burning their maps, and fleeing eastward in a chaotic, disorganized rout, leaving behind thousands of their own wounded men, heavy tanks, and artillery pieces frozen in the mud. But Patton wasn't about to let them escape back to the safety of Germany that easily. He had a very specific, deeply personal debt to settle on behalf of every single American boy whose life had been snuffed out in the dark, blood-soaked pines of the Hürtgen Forest. He was setting a massive, lethal trap of his own, a tactical maneuver so daring and aggressive that it would force the remaining German elite divisions into a final, catastrophic bottleneck, where they would have to face the ultimate, terrifying reckoning of American military might. But just how far was Patton willing to push his exhausted, freezing men to achieve this total, crushing victory? And what would happen when he finally came face to face with the remnants of the German 5th Panzer Army in a showdown that would define the end of the Second World War? To understand the sheer, unbridled fury of what happened next, you have to realize that General George S. Patton wasn't the kind of man to just win a battle, shake hands, and call it a day. No, sir. Patton was a cold-blooded disciple of total war, who believed that once you got your enemy on the run, you didn't give them a single second to breathe, pray, or reload. By January of 1945, the Great Ardennes counteroffensive was rapidly turning into a massive, frozen graveyard for Hitler's last great army. But the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, the very same arrogant outfits whose staff officers had laughed themselves hoarse over the American bloodbath in the Hürtgen Forest, were desperately trying to execute a masterfully planned fighting retreat back behind the concrete safety of the Siegfried Line. They thought they could play the same old defensive game, trading space for time, leaving behind deadly rearguards of elite sniper teams and hidden anti-tank guns to slow down the American advance while they slipped away in the dark. But Patton had other plans, and they involved a level of fast-paced, high-octane American violence that these Prussian generals hadn't even deemed possible in their worst nightmares. Patton bypassed the traditional military playbook entirely, telling his division commanders that he didn't give a damn about securing their flanks or waiting for the slow-moving British forces to the north to catch up. He wanted a flat-out, high-speed, no-holds-barred race to the town of Hofelize, the crucial road junction where the Allied forces from the north and south were supposed to link up and trap the entire German army in a massive steel-jawed vice. Our GIs, fueled by a mixture of hot coffee, pure adrenaline, and a burning desire to avenge the cold, lonely deaths of their buddies who had been left to rot in the mud of the Hürtgen, pushed their machines and their bodies far past the breaking point. Think about those 18 and 19-year-old American kids, many of whom had never seen snow before this winter, sitting in the open, freezing turrets of their Sherman tanks for 18 hours straight, their fingers so numb they could barely pull the triggers of their heavy, 50-caliber machine guns, yet they kept pushing forward through the snowdrifts, kicking butt and taking names. When the German 7th Army tried to set up a defensive line along the Schur River, thinking the deep icy water would stop Patton's advance, American engineers, under the cover of a freezing morning fog, didn't even wait for proper bridging equipment. They literally threw together improvised wooden footbridges and rubber pontoon rafts under intense, incoming machine gun fire, allowing our infantry to storm across the icy waters and catch the Germans completely off guard in their warm sleeping bags. Patton's 6th Tactical Air Command, working hand-in-hand with his ground forces, turned the snowy roads of Belgium into a literal highway to hell, spotting the long crawling columns of retreating German tanks, half-tracks, and supply wagons that were jammed bumper to bumper on the narrow, icy mountain passes and unleashing a relentless deluge of napalm, high-explosive bombs, and rockets that turned the pristine white snow into a black, smoking wasteland of burning rubber, scorched flesh, and melted steel. The very German officers who had scoffed at the soft American soldiers were now experiencing a terrifying face-to-face lesson in what happens when the full, industrial might of the United States of America is focused entirely on your destruction. Patton's artillery units, executing a devastating tactic known as time on target, where multiple batteries from miles away would fire their shells at different intervals, so they would all detonate on the exact same spot at the exact same microsecond, literally pulverized entire German regiments before they could even deploy into battle positions. It was a level of absolute, unmitigated devastation that broke the spirit of even the most fanatical SS troops, who began surrendering by the thousands, hands on their heads, shivering, crying, and begging for mercy from the very American boys they had mocked just weeks before. But Patton wasn't done playing his hand, because his ultimate goal wasn't just to capture territory or take prisoners. He wanted to personally deliver a message to the German High Command that would ring out loud and clear through the halls of history. A message written in the smoking ruins of their finest divisions. He pushed his armored spearheads further and faster, cutting off the escape routes of the German 60th Panzer Grenadier Division and the elite 5th Parachute Division, squeezing them into a shrinking pocket where they had to choose between unconditional surrender or complete, utter annihilation under the relentless pounding of American artillery. As the remnants of these shattered German units were forced back toward the German border, Patton stood on a snowy ridge overlooking the battlefield, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the spectacular, fiery end of the forces that had dared to laugh at American courage, his heart swelling with pride for the incredible, unbeatable grit of his American GIs, who had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, who the real masters of winter warfare were. But the most epic, mind-blowing part of this story isn't just the tactical victory or the physical destruction of the German army. It's what Patton did when his scouting units finally captured the actual field headquarters of the Wehrmacht 7th Army, discovering the personal diaries, official papers, and the very officers who had signed off on those mocking reports about the Hürtgen Forest. What Patton did to those captured aristocratic German generals, and the legendary jaw-dropping gift he decided to send straight to the High Command in Berlin, is a moment of pure, unadulterated American swagger that will make you want to stand up and cheer. When the forward scouting elements of Patton's legendary 90th Infantry Division finally overran the fortified, subterranean concrete command bunker of the German 7th Army near the Luxembourg border, they didn't just find abandoned maps and empty bottles of expensive French champagne. They uncovered a goldmine of highly classified documents, including the personal diaries and official battle logs of high-ranking Wehrmacht staff officers who had meticulously detailed their defense of the Hürtgen Forest just weeks prior. As the translation team scrambled to decipher the elegant German script, they found page after page of pure, unadulterated arrogance, with Prussian officers laughing at the childish tactical mistakes of the American 28th Infantry Division, mocking the tears of young American GIs who had been trapped in the dark woods, and calling the United States military a nation of soft, pampered factory workers who lacked the genetic warrior spirit of the German master race. When these translated documents were hand-delivered to General George S. Patton at his newly established command post, the officers in the room watched as the color literally drained from Patton's face, replaced by a dark, terrifying crimson fury that made his ivory-handled Colt .45 pistols practically shake on his hips as he read the mocking words of the enemy over and over again. His jaw clenched so tight it looked like solid granite. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things. Instead, he let out a low, icy, dangerous hiss, looking up at his top commanders and declaring that he was going to personally give these high and mighty German aristocrats a lesson in American manners that would be written in the ashes of their army. Within hours, Patton ordered his security detail to bring the captured high-ranking German staff officers, including a pompous, monocle-wearing Prussian colonel, who had been one of the primary authors of the mocking Hürtgen reports, straight to his headquarters for a face-to-face meeting that they would remember for the rest of their miserable lives. Picture the scene. These captured German officers, still trying to maintain their aristocratic superior bearing in their clean gray uniforms with silver shoulder boards, were marched into a freezing, drafty stone barn where Patton stood waiting for them, illuminated by a single, harsh overhead light bulb, looking like a towering god of war in his pristine helmet, gleaming riding boots, and a heavy trench coat that smelled of gunpowder and diesel. The German colonel, trying to act brave, clicked his heels together and saluted, but Patton just stared at him with cold, dead eyes that could cut through solid armor plate, slowly walking up to him until he was standing so close the German could smell the strong tobacco on Patton's breath. Patton slowly reached into his pocket, pulled out the translated German diary entry, mocking the American casualties of the Bloody Bucket Division, crumbled it up into a tight ball, and shoved it directly into the mouth of the stunned German colonel, barking out in his high-pitched, piercing voice that if the German army found American blood so funny, they could start by eating their own words. Patton then grabbed the collar of the colonel's expensive wool coat, dragged him over to a frost-covered window, and forced him to look outside at the endless, roaring highway where the massive, unstoppable columns of the U.S. Third Army were rolling north, thousands of battle-hardened GIs hanging off the sides of Sherman tanks, massive 155 mm long-tom artillery pieces being towed by heavy trucks, and tough-as-nails doughboys who looked like absolute, cold-blooded killers, their faces hardened by the winter cold and their eyes burning with a desire for vengeance. Patton leaned in close to the trembling German officer's ear and told him that the soft weekend warriors he had laughed at in the Hürtgen Forest had just marched over 100 miles through a historic blizzard, smashed the finest panzer divisions of the Third Reich to pieces, and rescued the 101st Airborne in a display of military power that the Wehrmacht couldn't pull off in its wildest dreams. But Patton wasn't done with his psychological demolition of the German High Command. He wanted to send a message that would reverberate all the way to Adolf Hitler's underground bunker in Berlin. So he ordered his MPs to strip these captured German officers of their fancy coats, their medals, and their boots, forcing them to stand in the freezing mud of the courtyard in their socks, while hundreds of dirty, laughing American GIs marched past them, throwing empty K-ration tins and snowballs at the very men who had mocked their fallen brothers. Patton then took the official red-inked stamp of the United States Third Army headquarters, slammed it down onto the cover of the captured German reports about the Hürtgen Forest, and hand-wrote a personal note across the front in thick black ink that read, "We have read your jokes. The laughing is over. Patton." He then handed the stamped documents to a terrified, low-ranking German courier they had captured, gave him a fresh pair of boots and a bicycle, and ordered him to ride straight through the lines back to the German High Command to deliver Patton's personal reply directly to the generals who had written those arrogant words. It was an epic, unforgettable act of pure American swagger and psychological warfare that utterly crushed what little morale the remaining German officers had left, proving to them that the Americans weren't just winning the war on the battlefield, they had completely broken the spirit of the German military machine. As Patton watched the terrified courier pedaling away into the snowy horizon, he turned to his staff with a fierce, proud smile on his face and whispered that the boys of the Hürtgen Forest could finally rest in peace, because their country had just stood up, fought back, and wiped the arrogant smirk off the face of the enemy forever. This is the incredible, untold story of how one legendary American general refused to let the memory of our fallen heroes be insulted by a defeated enemy, proving that when the chips are down, there is no force on God's green earth more terrifying, more resilient, or more badass than the United States Army under the command of George S. Patton. When that shivering, shell-shocked German courier finally pedaled his squeaking bicycle through the smoking, crater-scarred ruins of the front line and staggered into the high-security bunker of the German 7th Army's remnants, the scene inside was a far cry from the smug, cognac-sipping party of a few weeks prior. General Erich Brandenberger and his remaining staff were huddled around a map table, lit by sputtering candles, the distant bone-rattling thud of Patton's heavy 155 mm artillery vibrating through the concrete walls like the steady, terrifying heartbeat of an approaching monster. When the courier, shaking like a leaf and covered in frozen mud, laid that stamped, mud-splattered folder on the table, the very same folder containing their arrogant reports mocking the American losses in the Hürtgen Forest, now defaced with Patton's roaring, black-inked promise that the laughing is over. The silence that fell over the room was so heavy you could have heard a pin drop on the concrete floor. The German officers stared at that bold signature, Patton, and in that single chilling moment, they realized with absolute gut-wrenching certainty that they weren't just losing a campaign. They had personally summoned a demon of their own making, a relentless, iron-willed American warrior who was hell-bent on dragging them down into the fiery depths of defeat. The psychological impact of Patton's badass, no-nonsense reply spread through the German ranks faster than a wildfire in a dry pine forest, completely shattering the myth of German superiority and leaving their frontline commanders paralyzed with fear. Because they knew that the man leading the charge against them didn't care about tactical retreats, rules of engagement, or political compromises. He was coming to wipe them off the face of the earth. Outside the bunker, the cold, hard reality of Patton's wrath was already manifesting in a relentless, around-the-clock beat down as the U.S. Third Army, now completely unstoppable and riding high on the euphoria of breaking the siege of Bastogne, smashed through the Siegfried Line's massive concrete dragon's teeth like they were made of cheap plaster. Our boys, those brave, resilient GIs who had been called weekend warriors by the aristocratic Prussian brass, were now veterans of the harshest winter warfare imaginable, and they were kicking ass and taking names with a level of raw, aggressive swagger that had the entire Wehrmacht shaking in their jackboots. Patton was right there at the front of the spearhead, his highly polished helmet catching the winter sun, urging his tank commanders to ignore their flanks, bypass enemy strongpoints, and just keep driving deep into the heart of the fatherland, telling them that the faster they ran, the fewer Americans would die, and the sooner they could make the German High Command eat a giant plate of crow. The German Seventh Army, which had bragged about turning the Hürtgen Forest into a slaughterhouse for American youth, was literally torn to shreds, its soldiers fleeing eastward in a disorganized panic, throwing away their weapons, their gear, and even their uniforms, just to escape the terrifying, relentless pursuit of Patton's armored divisions. As the Third Army crossed the Rhine River in March of 1945, Patton did something so hilariously disrespectful and purely American that it has gone down in the annals of military history as the ultimate victory lap. He stood in the middle of a newly constructed pontoon bridge, looked down at the mighty, historic German river that the Nazi propaganda machine claimed would never be crossed by Allied boots, and proudly took a leak right off the side of the bridge, smiling like a kid on Christmas morning, and declaring to his staff that he had just personally pissed in the Rhine to show the world what he thought of the German master race. It was the perfect, ultimate exclamation point to a campaign that had started with German generals laughing at American blood and ended with those very same generals begging for mercy under the shadow of American tanks. But while the victory was sweet, and the arrogant laughter of the Wehrmacht had been permanently silenced, the emotional scars of the green hell of the Hürtgen Forest still ran incredibly deep in the hearts of the men who survived it, and Patton knew that the true cost of this triumph was paid in the blood of those 33,000 young Americans who would never get to see the spring of 1945. He made sure that the story of their sacrifice and the brutal, decisive vengeance he had delivered on their behalf was told to every single reinforcement joining the ranks, ensuring that the legacy of the Bloody Bucket and the brave GIs of the Hürtgen would never be forgotten or overshadowed by the headlines of the fast-moving push toward Berlin. But even as the war in Europe drew to its chaotic, dramatic close, and the Nazi Empire crumbled into dust, a new, highly dangerous mystery began to unfold in the occupied zones, one that would once again put Patton directly in the crosshairs of his own superiors and the surviving remnants of the German military elite. Rumors began to swirl that some of the very German generals who had authorized the mocking reports about the Hürtgen Forest had slipped through the dragnet, hiding behind false identities and clutching top-secret intelligence that could spark a whole new conflict between the Western Allies and the rising threat of the Soviet Union. Patton, with his legendary, razor-sharp instincts, was already on their trail, but what he discovered in the deep hidden bunkers of the defeated Reich would not only shock him to his core, but would set off a chain of events so explosive that it threatened to tear the fragile Allied coalition apart and change the course of human history forever. What exactly did Patton find in those secret files, and how did it lead to his mysterious, highly controversial final clash with the political elites back in Washington? As the smoke finally cleared over the blackened, hollowed-out ruins of Berlin in May of 1945, and the world threw the mother of all bloc parties to celebrate the surrender of Nazi Germany, General George S. Patton wasn't popping champagne corks or slapping bureaucrats on the back. No, sir. Old Blood and Guts was pacing the floor of his Bavarian headquarters like a caged panther, his legendary G2 intelligence boys uncovering a massive, highly classified rat nest that made his blood boil all over again. See? While Uncle Sam was busy trying to figure out how to rebuild a broken Europe, some of those very same arrogant Prussian generals and high-ranking Wehrmacht staff officers who had laughed at our dying boys in the Hürtgen Forest were pulling off the ultimate double cross, slipping out of their SS and Wehrmacht uniforms, burning their military IDs, and hiding out in deep underground Bavarian alpine redoubts with suitcases filled with looted gold, bearer bonds, and top-secret military files. These weren't just any regular files. These guys had spent the final months of the war meticulously documenting the weaknesses of the American military machine, compiling lists of our tactical vulnerabilities, and they were planning to use this classified intel as a get-out-of-jail-free card, offering to sell their souls and their secrets to either the Western Allies or the rapidly encroaching Soviet Red Army in exchange for immunity from war crimes tribunals. Patton's elite counterintelligence squads, acting on tips from local informants who were sick to death of the Nazi regime, raided a seemingly abandoned medieval castle tucked away in the misty Bavarian Alps. And what they found in the deep, damp stone cellars was enough to blow the lid off the entire Allied occupation. Crates upon crates of secret documents, and huddled in the corner, trying to look like innocent civilians, were several of the key Wehrmacht staff officers who had personally drafted those mocking, sarcastic memos during the Hürtgen Forest campaign. When Patton got the call that his boys had bagged these high-value targets, he didn't send a team of polite diplomats to ask them questions. He personally rode out to that alpine castle in his armored command jeep, his twin ivory handled revolvers catching the cold mountain light, ready to show these arrogant pencil pushers that the bill for their disrespect had finally come due. Patton walked into that cold holding cell, looked down at these trembling, once mighty officers of the German High Command, who were now desperately trying to bargain for their lives, and flat out told them that their fancy military degrees and their aristocratic family names didn't mean a hill of beans to him. They were nothing but low-life cowards who had laughed while American heroes bled, and he was going to make sure they faced the ultimate, cold, hard justice of a military court. But as Patton's intelligence officers began to dig deeper into the captured files, they stumbled upon something far more terrifying and explosive than anyone had anticipated. A massive, highly coordinated Soviet plan to build a Red Empire that would stretch all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, using the chaos of a defeated Germany to launch a sudden, massive surprise invasion of Western Europe before the United States could even ship its troops back home. Patton, with his uncanny, almost psychic ability to read the battlefield of the future, immediately realized that the end of World War II was just the opening act for an even bigger, more catastrophic global conflict against the brutal, iron-fisted tyranny of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. while the big wigs and politicians back in Washington were busy playing nice guy diplomats, shaking hands with Soviet generals and singing songs of eternal friendship. Patton was shouting from the rooftops that the Red Army was a massive, predatory beast that only understood one language: absolute, overwhelming, kick-ass military force. He openly advocated for keeping the U.S. Third Army fully mobilized, rearming the captured, non-Nazi German divisions under American supervision, and driving the Soviet forces back to their pre-war borders before they could build an atomic bomb and hold the entire free world hostage. Of course, this kind of raw, unfiltered, no bullcrap truth-telling didn't sit well with the slick, politically minded brass hats in the Pentagon or the politically sensitive Dwight D. Eisenhower, who were terrified that Patton's legendary mouth and aggressive posturing would accidentally spark World War III and send millions of exhausted American soldiers back into the meat grinder. The tension between Patton and the political elites back home grew so hot it could have melted steel, with the media launching a massive smear campaign to paint the legendary general as an unstable, war-mongering relic of the past who had finally lost his mind in the stress of battle. But Patton, being the stubborn, red-blooded patriot that he was, refused to back down or play the game of political correctness, whispering to his closest aides that he would rather die on his feet fighting for the truth than live on his knees watching his beloved country get played for fools by a bunch of communist dictators and spineless politicians. He knew that the surviving German officers he had captured were watching this political soap opera with greedy, hopeful eyes, waiting for the perfect moment to slip through the cracks of the fractured Allied alliance and escape justice altogether. Patton was preparing to make one final, incredibly bold, and dangerous move that would bypass his superiors entirely and expose the deep, dark secrets of the Soviet-Allied alliance to the American public, a move so explosive it would have completely rewritten the history books and changed the fate of the entire modern world. But just as Patton was putting the finishing touches on his master plan to expose the truth, a sudden, highly suspicious, and tragic event occurred on a cold, foggy road in Germany, an event that would shock the nation, silence the legendary general forever, and leave millions of Americans wondering if the man who saved Bastogne had been taken out by the very forces he was trying to expose. What really happened on that fateful December day in 1945, and did Patton's final, heroic crusade to honor his fallen soldiers and protect his country cost him his life in a web of deep state conspiracy and international intrigue? On December 9, 1945, on a cold, gray, and foggy morning in Mannheim, Germany, the final, tragic act of General George S. Patton's epic life unfolded in a way that still has historians, military buffs, and patriotic Americans scratching their heads and looking for answers. Patton, who had survived machine gun fire in World War I, tank battles across the blistering deserts of North Africa, and the freezing, artillery-shattered hell of the Battle of the Bulge, was preparing to head back home to the United States to finally retire, throw off the muzzle of military censorship, and tell the American public the absolute, unfiltered truth about how our boys had been betrayed by political red tape, and how the threat of Soviet communism was being swept under the rug. He had booked his ticket, packed his bags, and was going out for one last relaxing pheasant hunting trip with his chief of staff, General Hobart Hap Gay, in his luxurious, custom-outfitted 1938 Cadillac Model 75 limousine. As the heavy car glided through the damp, ruined streets of the German industrial sector, a massive, 2.5-ton military cargo truck driven by a questionable American soldier named Robert L. Thompson suddenly made an abrupt, completely illogical, and unsignaled left turn directly into the path of Patton's Cadillac. It wasn't a high-speed crash. Both vehicles were traveling at less than 20 miles per hour, and while General Gay, the driver, and even the truck driver walked away from the fender bender without a single scratch, Patton was thrown violently forward, his head slamming directly into the sharp metal frame of the partition behind the driver's seat, snapping his neck, fracturing his cervical vertebrae, and leaving him instantly paralyzed from the neck down. Now, folks, let that sink in for a second. The most aggressive, untouchable, and feared combat general in American history, a man who had stared down German Tiger tanks and spit in the face of death 1,000 times, was suddenly brought down by a low-speed fender bender on a deserted European road under circumstances that were so incredibly shady they practically screamed cover up. There was no official police report filed at the scene. The driver of the truck miraculously disappeared from the record shortly after, and some of the key eyewitnesses were never properly questioned by military authorities, leading many to believe that Patton's outspoken, no-nonsense attitude had made him too dangerous to be allowed back on American soil, where he could blow the whistle on the deep state secrets of the post-war Allied occupation. For 12 grueling days, Patton fought his final and most painful battle in a cold, sterile hospital bed in Heidelberg, his legendary, unbreakable spirit still shining through the agonizing pain as he joked with his wife, Beatrice, and whispered to his doctors that he just wanted to get back on his feet so he could keep fighting for his country. But on December 21st, 1945, the man who had silenced the mocking laughter of the Wehrmacht with a wave of pure American iron and blood finally closed his eyes for the last time, his heart giving out after a sudden, highly suspicious pulmonary embolism that some conspiracy theorists believe was secretly induced by agents who wanted to keep his mouth shut forever. When news of his passing hit the airwaves back home, a deep, heavy cloud of grief settled over the United States, as millions of everyday, working-class Americans wept for the loss of their favorite, straight-shooting general. A man who had loved his GIs like they were his own sons, and who had never hesitated to stick up for them when the high and mighty brass hats tried to treat them like expandable pawns on a chessboard. Patton didn't want to be buried in some fancy elite cemetery back in Washington, surrounded by the very politicians who had tried to ruin his name. Instead, according to his own wishes, he was laid to rest in the American cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, placed at the very head of his fallen soldiers from the Third Army, so that he could stand eternal guard over the brave boys who had given their lives to crush the Nazi regime. And what about those arrogant German generals who had laughed so heartily at the American losses in the green hell of the Hürtgen Forest? Well, their smug smiles were permanently erased from history as they spent the rest of their miserable, defeated lives in dark, damp Allied prison cells, stripped of their fancy titles, their looted wealth, and their pride, forced to watch as the United States of America rebuilt a free, democratic Europe from the ashes of the Reich they had claimed would last for 1,000 years. The epic story of how Patton turned a logistical nightmare into a masterpiece of military vengeance, driving his Third Army through a raging blizzard to rescue the trapped paratroopers at Bastogne and make the Wehrmacht choke on their own arrogant words, stands as the ultimate, definitive proof of the unbeatable, resilient, and badass spirit of the American soldier. It teaches us that no matter how dark the forest, no matter how deep the snow, and no matter how loud the enemy laughs, when the chips are down and the freedom of the world is on the line, our boys will always find a way to stand up, fight back, and secure victory. If this incredible, heart-pounding journey through one of the most dramatic, untold chapters of World War II made your chest swell with pride for our nation's heroes, we want to hear from you right now. Now that we've seen the final tragic curtain fall on the physical life of General George S. Patton, we have to take a hard, unfiltered look at the cold, brutal military science of why those German generals got it so incredibly wrong in the first place, and why their fatal mistake of laughing at our GIs in the Hürtgen Forest ultimately cost them their entire empire. You see, those aristocratic Prussian officers sitting high and mighty in their clean, warm underground headquarters, were looking at the war through the dusty, outdated lenses of 19th-century European military academies, believing that the true measure of a soldier was found only in mindless, goose-stepping discipline and a lifetime of professional military breeding. When they looked at the American Army, they didn't see a professional warrior class. They saw a ragtag collection of former farmers, factory workers, coal miners, and city kids who had been pulled out of their civilian lives just a couple of years prior, throwing them into uniform with a crash course in basic training. The German High Command honestly believed that because our boys complained about the lack of hot turkey dinners, missed their sweethearts back home, and preferred to fight with overwhelming artillery and air support rather than engaging in suicidal, bayonet-charging fanaticism, they were somehow soft, fragile, and lacked the stomach for a real, down-and-dirty, frozen-to-the-bone infantry fight. But what those arrogant Wehrmacht staff officers completely failed to realize was that the American soldier possessed something far more powerful and unpredictable than any state-mandated Nazi indoctrination they had: the raw, unbreakable spirit of a free people who had survived the grinding poverty of the Great Depression. Men who had learned how to fix old Ford tractors with baling wire, hunt wild game in the Appalachian Mountains, and stand up to local bullies on the streets of Chicago and Brooklyn. When the incompetent Allied High Command, specifically generals like Courtney Hodges and Omar Bradley, kept stubbornly ordering our boys directly into the green hell of the Hürtgen Forest, launching slow, predictable, and unimaginative frontal assaults against heavily fortified German concrete pillboxes, our GIs didn't fail because they were soft. They were simply betrayed by a terrible tactical plan that stripped them of their mobility and left them exposed to pre-ranged, devastating tree-burst artillery fire. Yet, even as their units were cut to ribbons, with the 28th Bloody Bucket Division losing almost its entire infantry strength in the freezing mud, those American boys didn't just roll over and surrender. They fought like absolute cornered tigers, holding on to key muddy ridges and frozen crossroads with a grim, silent determination that actually bled the German defending divisions white and set the stage for the Wehrmacht's ultimate exhaustion. When Patton caught wind of the mocking German reports, he knew instantly that the German generals' laughter was a desperate psychological coping mechanism to hide their own growing terror. And he realized that the best way to avenge the tragedy of the Hürtgen was to completely abandon the slow, grinding, attritional warfare of his fellow Allied commanders and unleash the full, terrifying potential of American speed, firepower, and mechanical ingenuity. Patton's operational philosophy was simple: grab 'em by the nose and kick 'em in the pants, a doctrine of relentless, high-speed maneuver warfare that bypassed strong points, cut off supply lines, and kept the enemy in a constant state of absolute panic and disorganization. By turning his entire Third Army 90 degrees north in the middle of a historic blizzard, Patton didn't just pull off a logistical miracle. He demonstrated to the German High Command that the American military machine was highly flexible, incredibly resourceful, and possessed an industrial and logistical capability that the horse-drawn, fuel-starved Wehrmacht could only dream of. The GIs of the Third Army didn't just march to the rescue of Bastogne. They rode on a wave of pure, industrialized American power, supported by thousands of heavy trucks, armored half-tracks, and highly coordinated mobile artillery batteries that could rain steel on any target in a matter of minutes. Proving once and for all that Uncle Sam didn't just fight harder, he fought smarter, faster, and with a level of mechanical coordination that transformed modern warfare forever. This is the ultimate enduring legacy of the triumph over the arrogant Wehrmacht. It proved that the American democratic system could produce citizen soldiers who, when properly led by a bold, aggressive commander like Patton, could outthink, outmarch, and outfight the most professional, battle-hardened military dictatorship on Earth. Today, as the wind rustles through the quiet, peaceful pines of the Hürtgen Forest, and the moss slowly grows over the crumbling concrete ruins of the Siegfried Line. The memory of those 33,000 American casualties stands not as a monument to defeat, but as a sacred testament to the price of freedom and the unbeatable grit of a generation that refused to back down. And for those of us who still carry the blood of those patriots in our veins, this story serves as a timeless, heart-pounding reminder that the United States of America is a nation built on the shoulders of giants, men who left their homes to cross a vast ocean and pull down a dark, murderous empire, leaving a message of freedom that will echo through the halls of history for as long as our flag still flies. To truly appreciate the legendary scale of what General George S. Patton pulled off, you have to look past the cold, hard numbers on a military map and zoom straight in on the raw, beating heart of the American soldier, the everyday GIs, who went from the absolute depths of a frozen, hellish despair to the highest peaks of a glorious, kick-ass victory. Think about what it was like for a 19-year-old kid from the heartland of America, standing in a muddy trench in the middle of the Hürtgen Forest, his boots soaked through with freezing water, his fingers so stiff from the biting cold that he could barely squeeze the trigger of his M1 Garand, listening to the terrifying buzzsaw roar of German MG-42 machine guns cutting down his buddies left and right. For weeks, those boys had been told by their own high command to keep pushing forward into a meat grinder that made absolutely no tactical sense, watching their officers make mistake after mistake while the arrogant German Wehrmacht mocked them from their dry, concrete bunkers, calling them soft, pampered weekend warriors who didn't have the stomach for a real fight. But when Patton stepped into the arena and took the reins, everything changed in a heartbeat. It was like a jolt of pure, high-voltage electricity surged through the veins of the entire Allied line, transforming a battered defensive force into a roaring, aggressive juggernaut that didn't know the meaning of the word surrender. Patton didn't just give his men better logistics or more artillery support. He gave them back their pride, their swagger, and their belief that they were the baddest, toughest, and most unstoppable force of freedom on the face of the earth. He proved to the entire world that the American way of life, built on freedom, individual initiative, and the sheer, stubborn refusal to let anyone tell you what you can and cannot do, didn't make our boys soft. It made them incredibly resourceful, highly adaptable, and deadlier than any brainwashed, goose-stepping soldier the Nazi regime could throw at them. While the German army relied on a rigid, top-down command structure where officers were treated like minor gods and ordinary soldiers were expected to obey mindlessly, the U.S. military under Patton thrived on decentralized, fast-moving chaos, where a lone American sergeant or corporal, finding himself cut off in a snowdrift with a jammed radio, wouldn't just sit there waiting for orders. He would gather up whatever men and ammo he had left, formulate a plan on the fly, and launch a devastating flank attack that would catch the Germans completely off guard. This was the secret weapon that the smug Prussian generals in their cozy headquarters never saw coming. The sheer, unpredictable, and explosive ingenuity of the American citizen soldier, who could fix a shattered tank tread with a blowtorch and some scrap metal, use a captured German Panzerfaust to blow open a concrete bunker, or coordinate a precision artillery strike using nothing but a map and a pair of pocket binoculars. When Patton's Third Army slammed into the German flank during the Battle of the Bulge, it wasn't just a clash of two massive armies. It was a head-on collision between a dying, authoritarian empire built on fear and arrogance, and a rising, young, and fiercely independent republic built on the backs of everyday heroes who were fighting for their homes, their families, and the buddies standing right next to them in the freezing mud. The sheer speed and violence of Patton's counteroffensive literally rewrote the rules of modern warfare, proving that mobility, aggressive spirit, and overwhelming firepower would always triumph over static, concrete defense lines and outdated Prussian dogma. And as the German lines began to crumble and shatter under the weight of this relentless American onslaught, those very same Wehrmacht officers who had laughed so loudly at our losses in the Hürtgen Forest were forced to watch their dream of global domination dissolve into a chaotic, terrifying nightmare of burning panzers, retreating columns, and thousands of their own men throwing down their weapons in absolute surrender. But the story of Patton's righteous vengeance doesn't end on the battlefields of Europe, because even after the guns fell silent and the Nazi flag was dragged through the mud, the legacy of what our boys achieved under his command continued to shape the destiny of the free world for generations to come, serving as a timeless, powerful reminder of what happens when you underestimate the fighting spirit of the United States of America. Yet, as we look back on this legendary chapter of history, a haunting, deeply controversial question still lingers in the minds of historians and patriots alike. What if Patton had been allowed to keep driving his tanks east, to push back the Soviet Red Army and secure a truly free Europe before the Iron Curtain fell across the continent? And did his mysterious, untimely death in that suspicious car crash prevent the greatest general of our time from saving the world from yet another brutal, global tyranny? The deeper you dig into the classified archives, the stranger the official story becomes, leaving us with a web of international intrigue, secret intelligence reports, and hidden agendas that will make you look at the end of World War II in a completely different light. The truth is, folks, that the full, unvarnished story of what General George S. Patton did when those arrogant Wehrmacht staff officers laughed about American losses in the Hürtgen Forest is so much bigger, so much deeper, and so much more emotionally powerful than any Hollywood blockbuster could ever capture on screen. Because it's not just a story about tanks, artillery, and military strategy. It's a deeply personal, soul-stirring testament to the unbreakable bond between a legendary commander and the ordinary American boys he loved like his own flesh and blood. When Patton read those translated German diaries mocking the tears and the suffering of our young GIs in the frozen, blood-soaked pines of the Hürtgen, something snapped inside him that went far beyond professional military pride. It was the righteous, volcanic fury of a father who had just been told that someone was laughing at his sons while they bled and died in a dark, forgotten corner of the world. Every single decision Patton made from that moment forward the impossible 90-degree pivot through a historic blizzard, the legendary relief of Bastogne, the merciless destruction of the German 5th Panzer Army, and the deeply personal, face-to-face humiliation of those captured, smug Wehrmacht officers was driven by an intensely emotional, almost spiritual commitment to proving that the blood of American heroes was not something to be mocked, dismissed, or forgotten by anyone, anywhere, at any time in the history of this great nation. And when you visit the American cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg today, where Patton's simple white cross stands at the head of over 5,000 of his fallen Third Army soldiers, arranged in perfect, silent rows stretching across the green, manicured hillside, you can almost feel his presence still standing guard over his boys, his ivory-handled revolvers on his hips, his jaw set in that fierce, determined expression, whispering across the decades that as long as one American still draws breath, the sacrifice of these heroes will never be in vain. The locals in Luxembourg still lay fresh flowers on Patton's grave every single day, not because some government program told them to, but because the people of Europe have never forgotten that it was this loud, profane, brilliantly aggressive American general and his freezing, exhausted, but utterly unstoppable GIs who saved their towns, their families, and their freedom from the iron grip of Nazi tyranny during the darkest, coldest winter in living memory. Think about that for a second 80 years later, Ordinary European families are still honoring the memory of American soldiers who crossed an ocean to liberate people they had never met, fought through conditions that would break most modern armies, and paid the ultimate price so that strangers in a foreign land could live free. That is the true enduring legacy of what Patton did when the Wehrmacht laughed. He didn't just win a battle or silence a bunch of arrogant generals. He permanently etched the name of the United States of America into the bedrock of human history as the one nation on earth that will always, always, always stand up for what is right, no matter the cost, no matter the odds, and no matter how loud the enemy laughs. And for those of you sitting at home right now, watching this video, maybe sipping your morning coffee, or driving home from a long day at work, I want you to take a moment and really let this sink into your bones. The freedom you enjoy today, the ability to speak your mind, raise your family, and pursue your dreams without a government boot on your neck, was purchased at an unimaginable price by boys who were barely old enough to shave, boys who left behind everything they loved and marched into the frozen mouth of hell because they believed that some things in this world are worth fighting and dying for. The next time someone tries to tell you that America's greatest days are behind us, or that the American spirit is broken, or that we've gone soft as a nation, you tell them about Patton and his Third Army, about the boys of the Bloody Bucket who held the line in the Hürtgen Forest when every fiber of their being was screaming at them to quit, about the paratroopers of the 101st who refused to surrender at Bastogne, even when they were surrounded, freezing, and running out of everything except raw, stubborn American courage, and about the legendary general who turned the enemy's arrogant laughter into a symphony of absolute, crushing, and permanent defeat. That is who we are as a people. That is what runs through our veins. And that is why no force on God's green earth, past, present, or future, will ever be able to extinguish the blazing torch of American freedom. Now, before you click away, I want to personally thank every single one of you who stuck with us through this entire epic journey. From the dark, bloody forests of the Hürtgen to the frozen, heroic fields of Bastogne and beyond. If this story moved you, if it made your heart pound and your eyes water with pride for our greatest generation, then do us a solid and hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss another one of these incredible untold stories of American heroism that the mainstream media doesn't want you to hear. Smash that like button so hard your phone screen cracks. Share this video with every patriot you know, your dad, your grandpa, your battle buddy, your neighbor, because these stories deserve to be heard by millions, not buried in dusty history books that nobody reads anymore. Drop a comment right now, telling us what part of this story hit you the hardest, whether it was Patton's legendary 3-day march, the relief of Bastogne, or that bone-chilling moment when he shoved those mocking German words right back down the enemy's throat. And if you have a family member who served in World War II, in the Hürtgen Forest, at the Battle of the Bulge, or anywhere else across the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, we want to hear their story too, because every single one of those heroes deserves to be remembered, honored, and celebrated for as long as this great nation stands. This has been an absolute honor to share with you, and we will see you in the next video, where we're going to uncover another jaw-dropping, heart-pounding chapter of American military history that has been buried, censored, and forgotten for far too long. Until then, stay proud, stay free, and never, ever let anyone tell you that the American soldier is anything less than the greatest warrior the world has ever known. God bless our veterans. God bless the United States of America, and God bless the eternal memory of General George S. Patton and the brave, immortal heroes of the Third Army, who silenced the laughter of tyrants and lit the torch of freedom for all of humanity. We'll see you on the next one, Patriots.